Hi there, Wild Things. A quick housekeeping note for you all. I really hope you enjoyed Season 2. This interview will be the last bonus episode of the season. I'm turning my full attention to working on Season 3 now, and if all goes according to plan, it should be out in spring of 2022. Keep your eyes and ears on this podcast feed and on the Wild Things social media accounts. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Arik Kershenbaum. He's a zoologist at the University of Cambridge and the author of The Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy: What Animals on Earth Reveal About Aliens and Ourselves. We've speculated forever about what aliens might be like, and a lot of that speculation is based off of what we know about life on Earth, mostly because that's all we know. It's what we're familiar with. But in his book, Dr. Kershenbaum argues that that might be enough to understand alien life.
Yeah, there's a big difference between speculating and using the evidence that we have. Using evidence is not speculation. So there are certainly people speculate a lot about aliens because we haven't seen them, so we don't know what they're like. But we can infer rules, we can infer laws about how life behaves, how life evolves, how life needs to be from looking at the constraints on life on Earth. And that's really what I'm talking about.
But so you asked this question early on, what are the universal laws of biology that we can use to make predictions? But in some of the interviews that I've done with astrobiologists, I got the feeling that there were some questions about what those universal laws are.
That's right, because we do need to be open-minded about how life can work. There are potentially many different ways that life could exist, many different biochemistries, many different ways of capturing energy, using energy, moving it around, perhaps even many different ways of embodying yourself, having a different kind of body. That's certainly true. But there are still some things that are fundamental, that must be the same between life on Earth and life on other planets. And one of those is the essence of evolution by natural selection. It is the only way that complexity can accumulate. And what we're talking about, whenever we talk about life, we're talking about complexity, because even the simplest life is incredibly complex. And so the only way that can come into being is through this process of natural selection.
And we're sure that, we're not sure, obviously, because we haven't found life on other planets, but we think that process of natural selection is the only way forward.
Yes, it is. And it's really the only ways in which you can get complexity accumulating over time, more and more and more complex, is either through some sort of process where someone generates complexity. So something that's already complex builds something, like we might build a computer or a spaceship. But of course, that then doesn't answer the questions, where did that complex originator come from? And the other way that complexity can arise is by accumulation. So where certain behaviors, traits, characteristics that are favorable are retained, and ones that are random, don't contribute, lead to less complexity, they're discarded. That is the most general sort of formulation of this concept of evolution by natural selection. And those are really the only two ways that this can happen.
Okay. So, we're talking about how evolution works similarly in similar environments. But where we find life might not be similar to Earth, in that, it might be a methane ocean, or it might be some sort of, the air that they breathe, if they breathe, might be completely different. So how do we know how that evolution will work?
But one of the nice things about the whole process of evolution by natural selection is it's actually quite independent of the actual underlying mechanism. So it doesn't really matter whether you're based on DNA. It doesn't really matter whether you're carbon-based or not. Evolution by natural selection can operate on the strangest of things. It can operate on computer programs, for instance, or cultural ideas. So it's really independent of the underlying mechanism, and that's what makes it so appealing to astrobiologists, because it's true, we don't know what the mechanisms are. If you live in a methane ocean, then your biochemistry is going to be very different from that on Earth. If you live in the sulfuric acid clouds of Venus, for instance, then we know that our chemistry simply won't cope. But what we do know is that these hypothetical sulfuric acid loving organisms in the atmosphere of Venus must reproduce, and they must gain complexity from generation to generation. Otherwise, they just wouldn't have been there in the first place.
Okay. So how a planet is, its gravity, its weather, its chemical makeup, etc., that's going to dictate the form and function of the creatures that live on that planet.
That's right. And we have an increasing, I would say, understanding of the different kinds of planets that we feel might support life. Everyone knows that a planet that's like Earth might have Earth-like organisms on it. But we also think that there's a good chance of life evolving in underground oceans, such as we find on a couple of moons in our own solar system. And there'll be planets like that out there in the galaxy as well. And there are other, as we discover more and more about the physical characteristics of exoplanets, we can see there are quite a few that are reasonable candidates for potential life. The ones that are more similar to Earth are more likely to have similar mechanisms, similar biochemistries, and the ones that are very different. So, for instance, an underground ocean, you would expect evolution to take quite different path. But the fundamental laws, the fundamental rules that life is, that's dictating how that life evolves, will still remain the same.
Any favorites? Any planets or moons or bodies that you'd put money on finding life in?
Well, obviously, everyone's really excited about what's going on on Enceladus and places like that. Partly because they're very accessible. I think that we may very well in the next 10 years, 20 years, get some pretty good indications of life existing on planets in other solar systems. But it's going to be extremely difficult to be sure that it's really life that's causing these whatever signals we detect. On the other hand, bodies within our solar system, there's a realistic opportunity to go there and look. So I think people are pretty excited about that one, and me too. I think that the whole interest over Venus as well was particularly exciting. Because it allows us to test these ideas, test these technologies. Can we really detect these indications? If we detect them, then maybe we can go out and look and see whether our predictions were true. So I'd be very excited to see some missions to some of these potential life habitats in our own solar system.
Yeah. Me too. I'm looking forward to seeing what Dragonfly finds and some of these other missions that are coming up in the not too distant future. So what is an animal? How do we define that? And are humans animals? I know there's some people who might disagree with that.
Well, humans are certainly animals by any definition that we use currently, and our definition of animal, as with our definitions of all life on Earth for the last 150 years, have been based on lineage, been based on family tree. So you are a bird if you are closely related to other birds, more closely related to birds than to anything else. That's just how we happen to define things, since we understand that all life is essentially related to all other life. By that definition, animals are descendants of the common ancestor of the animals that lived 600, 700, 800 million years ago. And that's a very rigorous definition of animal. It doesn't say anything about what animals are like, doesn't say anything about how they move or how they live or what they eat. It just depends on who their ancestor was. All animals share this common ancestor, and we're more closely related to that creature than we are to a tree or a fungus or a bacteria. That definition of animal works really well on planet Earth because it's got a clear-cut mechanism behind it. We can trace that family tree all the way back. The thing is, though, when we think of animals, we think of other things. We think of animals as moving. We think of animals as going out and finding their food. And it's true that there are a few animals that don't move very much, but basically animals move. That's one of their big characteristics. So the big question that I pose in the book is, well, okay, if you landed on another planet and found creatures running around and eating each other, clearly they're not related to animals on Earth. They don't share a common ancestor with our own ancestor of the animals, but they seem so animal-like. Is it inappropriate to give them the label animal? And that's just really a question of asking ourselves, why are we using a particular term to define something? And I think that in this case, I think animal probably would be a good word to use for in a case like that.
Yeah, it's the other thing that sort of popped up into my head when I was reading this section. It was talking about, humans often think of themselves as being separate from animals. It kind of makes me wonder how we might treat quote unquote animals on other planets, and how we would see them and how we would sort of figure out what our relationship is with them and how we fit in with them. Where do they fit in the grand scheme?
Yeah, it's been an interesting subject that's been explored by a lot of science fiction writers.
Mm-hmm.
Either how would we recognize life? How would we identify something as being alive? Or perhaps we wouldn't recognize it when it really is. And how would we relate to organisms that are very different from ourselves? But I tend to think the problem is less severe than many people think. Astrobiologists spend quite a lot of time worrying about the definition of life. How are we going to come up with a robust definition of life that will work on any planet that we discover? Well, I tend to think it's going to be pretty obvious, actually. I actually think that even without a definition, I think that we'll know it when we see it. And I think we will relate to alien life really in very much the same way as we relate to life on Earth, precisely for the reason that you said, which is that humans tend to see ourselves as separate from the rest of life on Earth. And so in that sense, if we're going to deny our family relationship with animals and plants and on Earth, then we may there's no difference between an ant on Earth and an ant on another planet. But we've got quite a long way to go, I think, before we actually land on another planet and see these animals. I don't think that's really an issue we need to deal with in the next couple of years.
Going back to what you said about movement, why is movement important as part of this definition of what animals are?
Well, the big important thing about life, having just dismissed the exercise of defining life, I'm now going to use that. But one of the things that really defines life, or one of the things that's necessary for life, is that all life uses energy to create a state of order, to create a state of complexity. And we know that complex things tend to disintegrate in general. This is one of the characteristics of the universe. And so life is always using energy to keep itself going, to keep that complexity there, stop it from disintegrating. So all life needs energy. And that we can be very confident that is a rule that will apply to all life everywhere in the universe, just follows from the laws of physics. Where do you get your energy? Well, there are a number of places you can get energy. You can get energy from a star, like plants do. Of course, if you live in an underground ocean, you probably can't get energy from a star, but that's okay. There are other sources of energy. There's heat, there's gravitational friction heating the water, there's perhaps radioactive decay, many other sources of energy. But another source of energy is other life itself. So it's almost inevitable that in any complex ecosystem with any large number of diverse life forms of any sort, that some of them will be stealing energy from others, probably in the form of eating them. So predation is a pretty fundamental concept in the way that life must exist. And if animals are ingesting, or if life forms are ingesting other life forms to get their energy, then there's a big imperative on running away and catching who's running away. So when I talk about the laws of evolution, when I talk about, I'm not talking about laws of chemistry. I'm talking about the laws of how organisms must interact with each other. And this is a very good example that we can expect predation to exist. And if we expect predation to exist, then we can expect movement to exist as well, because you want to get away from the thing that wants to eat you. And, you want to eat the thing that's getting away from you. So movement is going to be a feature of any ecosystem. If everyone was staying still, there would just be a huge advantage to being the moving one. Of course, on Earth, some organisms don't move, but that's okay, because if everyone is moving, there's always an advantage to being the one staying still. Evolution works that way. It's always useful to be slightly different from everyone else. And that's why we get the diversity of forms that we see.
And how a creature moves, again, could likely be chalked up to the type of planet it exists on. It wouldn't necessarily be the same as on Earth, but it would be movement.
That's true. And movement, the physical act of movement, of course, is something that's quite well constrained by the laws of physics. But that means that we could expect similar movement on similar planets. So movement is going to be largely a function, if you're moving on a solid surface anyway, is largely a function of friction. And you want enough friction so that you can push against the ground and move, but not so much that it slows you down. And I'm going to be honest, legs are just a brilliant way of doing that. They're not, there's nothing special about legs on Earth. They're not a special Earthling invention. They just happen to be the best solution, given our laws of physics, to moving on a solid surface. And so I think we can be very confident that whatever alien animals look like, the ones that live on a solid surface, there'll be a lot of them out there that have legs.
Let's talk a little bit about communication. Why do you think communication would be the same amongst aliens as it is on Earth?
Well, communication is absolutely essential to animals. We don't think about that often, but then again, if animals move, which they do by and large, and they also mate, we haven't talked about sex yet, but assuming that we have organisms that are reproducing sexually, or at least not reproducing on their own, then they've got to find their mates. And that places a huge benefit on those that can communicate, if they can signal to potential mates and find each other that way. So in an ecosystem where organisms are moving a lot, you would expect communication to evolve. It's just a huge advantage. Now, whether the communication is going to be similar to communication on Earth or different, that's to some extent dependent on the physical environment of the planet. Clearly, on a planet with a very thin atmosphere like Mars, sound is not going to be a particularly efficient way of communicating. But on a planet with a decent atmosphere like Earth, then sound is incredibly effective. You'll notice that light, although it's a useful way to communicate, lots of animals do communicate using vision, but it tends to be blocked by objects of sort of a normal size, and so you can't see behind a tree. So on a planet covered in trees, then vision might not be a great way to communicate. So there are these physical constraints on how communication is going to take place, but the role of communication and the purpose for which it's used is likely to be very similar between animals that are occupying similar niches.
Okay, so basically, if you've got animals that are moving, you have to have some form of communication. One sort of leads into the other. Am I understanding that?
Yes, as you probably noticed, I did qualify that by saying if they need to find mates.
Right.
Now that's that opens up a whole can of alien worms that is very interesting question as well as to whether aliens will mate, and the jury on this one is very much out, because we still don't really know why sex evolved on Earth. Probably the best thing, probably the most confident thing that I can say is that if there is a planet with complex life, with complex ecosystems anyway, all life is complex. But if we were to discover a planet with complex ecosystems on it, chances are some kind of sex is going on. Doesn't mean that sex must evolve, because evolution doesn't have any foresight. It doesn't evolve sex so that there will be complexity. But retrospectively, if you see complexity, it's hard to imagine how that could evolve in any reasonable length of time without some kind of mating between individuals, some kind of sharing of hereditary information between individuals.
Okay. Is communication tied to intelligence?
Well, in a limited way, it is. So I think communication in general, no. As I said, you only need to want to find a mate to benefit from communication. It doesn't require a great deal of intelligence. Where intelligence comes into it, though, is in the complexity of the communication. Because if you have a lot to talk about, you need a more complex communicative system. And the kinds of animals that need to communicate in a complex way tend to be animals that live in groups, in societies. Obviously, if you live on your own, there's no one much to talk to except for, maybe your children and your mate when you're looking for them. If you live in a large group, there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more information that needs to be passed from one individual to another. So there's this close link between the complexity of an animal's society and the complexity of its communication. And we also believe that there's a strong link between the complexity of an animal's society and that animal's intelligence. I have to qualify that because, of course, intelligence is another one of those terms that we try to avoid defining. It's not that easy to define. There are many different kinds of intelligence. You can be intelligent in solving very specific problems, like how to crack open a nut or something like that. You don't need to live in a society to be intelligent in that sense. But there's a particular kind of intelligence that we humans tend to recognize and look at and say, oh, that animal's intelligent. And that rather difficult to define human-like intelligence almost certainly is very closely tied to social complexity and to interactions between individuals.
Yeah, and it often seems that, again, going back to the definition of intelligence and what you've just mentioned, we often kind of define it based on human-centric characteristics or behaviors, which may not encompass the entirety of what intelligence is. As you said, cracking open a nut, you don't need to be social or human or anything of that sort. But how do we define intelligence so that it extends beyond just behaviors that seem very human-centric?
Well, I think that we do have a fairly clear idea of what we mean by intelligence on Earth, even if it's hard to define. We've got some pretty good indicators. So learning has got a lot to do with intelligence. Can you learn to avoid some kind of food that's unhealthy, or learn to catch a prey, to get food in some kind of novel way? Learning is part of the whole intelligence story. Problem solving, as I said, is another way. Can you hide your food for the winter and then remember where it is and come back and get it, and things like that? So there are these features of intelligence that seem to be fairly clear, fairly self-evident. And then there's this kind of social intelligence. And there's this something else, which is, how do you get on in a group? How do you manage in a group? Can I make friends so that they support me when I'm having an argument with another animal in the group? Or, can I learn from them? If they have some food, will they share it with me? This kind of social intelligence, these interactions, having complex and advantageous interactions between individuals, seems to be a whole nother ball game. And this seems to be something that is much more identifiable for humans with human intelligence.
Yeah, I found this chapter absolutely fascinating. You talked about how social living facilitates information transfer, which of course helps with evolution to some degree, because you're advancing the species by passing on information. And I had not ever really considered that, but it makes complete sense.
Well, of course, you're only advancing yourself.
Right.
No one is evolving by advancing the species. It's always only a question of whether the individual is benefiting, but the individual, of course, does benefit in a society very often. This is why they do come together in societies.
Right, but then that information gets passed on. If it's useful information, it gets passed on. And doesn't that benefit us, eventually benefit a species?
Well, retrospectively, you can say that it might. Certainly, you can look at the human species and see, well, we as a species have benefited. But of course, that's not a mechanism. That's just a retrospective observation. The reality is, on Earth anyway, and I would claim probably on other planets as well, groups of animals, groups of individuals that come together tend to be related to each other. So, you have children and maybe they don't leave home and maybe they stay with you, or, maybe you have cousins and nieces and nephews and so on. So groups of animals are always more related than just a random selection of animals. And it's that, it's the fact that if you're helping other individuals in your group, you're actually helping your family, your kin. That seems to be what's driving this evolution of cooperation.
You also talked about how the fundamental nature of communication is influencing others, which I thought was a really interesting way to put that. What happens if aliens are better communicators?
Well,
this is very sci-fi speculation, but that's immediately what came into my head.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that communication evolved to manipulate is an interesting one, but it's very well accepted, that because of course any characteristic, any trait or behavior or ability evolves and will persist in a population if it's beneficial to the individuals that possess it. And it doesn't necessarily follow that it will spread in the population if it's beneficial to someone else. So an animal that communicates will gain a benefit for itself by communicating. Now, we tend to think of communication as being mutually beneficial because our communication, when we plan to meet at a restaurant or negotiate to buying a car or something like that, there's a mutual interaction and there's a mutual benefit from the communication. But the original communication itself evolved because it gave an advantage to an individual. That individual was manipulating its environment, persuading other individuals to do what they wanted, and that's the core of communication. But it doesn't mean, in fact, I think it definitely doesn't mean that a alien species that is, as you say, good at communicating, say with a complex language, would necessarily always be manipulative, because that complexity of language tends to arise out of mutualistic interaction, so where both sides benefit.
Okay, and language is different from communication.
Well, language is different from just communication. Yes, I think that's fairly clear. Well, we know that all animals communicate, and we know that trees and fungi communicate as well, but we wouldn't say they had a language. Now, what a language is exactly is, I think we're now on to the third thing that we don't want to define. Life, intelligence, and language. So it's not an easy thing to define precisely what language is, and that's partly because we only know one. We only know human language, so we haven't really got anything that we can compare and say, oh, well, this is a language as well. But language seems to be, at the very least, a method of communication that can embody a very, very large, if not unlimited, number of concepts. So it's not enough to be able to say a few things, maybe 5, 6, 10, 20 things. That's not a language. A language really needs to be able to say almost anything. And I think that's kind of how I would distinguish between a language and communication.
Okay, so I spent some time talking to Lawrence Doyle, who you know. He was part of one of the earlier episodes in this program, and he talked about how, whales they found syntax, and they found that Zipf's law applies to dolphins. Are they speaking languages, or we aren't sure yet? I was just curious about that.
Well, I think that so just to sort of recap the sort of thing that Lawrence is talking about is that when you look at the complexity of a communication or communicative signal in animals, it may be more complex, it may be less complex. An animal that just says squeak, squeak, squeak is obviously not saying anything very complex. But we've got some reason to believe that language, like really effective language, the kind of language that would evolve to convey complex ideas and complex information, is probably balanced between simplicity and complexity. A really effective language probably isn't very, very complex. It's got to be efficient as well. So what we can do, and what we do, is to look in animal communication, or in signals from outer space even, for that balance between complexity and simplicity. And as you said, as Lawrence and others have said, if we look at whales, we look at dolphins, there is an indication that their communication also is balanced between simplicity and complexity. And it's balanced in a very similar way to the way that our language is balanced. Now, does that mean that it's a language? No, it means that one of the prerequisites of language has probably been met. So if we say that languages almost certainly have this balance, great. Whales have this balance. But there are many reasons that they might have that balance. It's probably just a very efficient way to communicate, to be nicely balanced between simplicity and complexity. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have that sort of infinite communicative ability. So I think it's probably premature to say that whales have language just because they have this effective and efficient level of complexity in their communication. But it's certainly a very interesting discovery, because it does show again that these laws of finding optimal solutions seem to apply quite broadly in the animal kingdom, and they probably apply on other planets as well.
So, in other words, language evolves in the same way that a lot of these other things evolve as part of a species continuum.
Well, that's another difficult question. Whether or not human language evolved as a continuum, or whether it was a sudden and dramatic innovation, is another very contentious issue. And part of the problem, apart from the fact that we really have no way of knowing how that actually happened, there's no fossil record of language, but it's very difficult to say whether our ancestors, generation by generation, communicated more and more and more complex, in a more and more complex way until they arrived at language, or whether something happened relatively rapidly in which a new innovation arose and that became language. And scientists tend to favor the latter hypothesis at the moment.
Okay. Why?
Well, for one thing, it's a little bit hard to imagine how a slow progression could really provide any particular benefit. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that there are features of language which seem to be discretely different, so that they're actually a step change from non-linguistic communication. And most likely these are relatively, although they seem like complex innovations, they're probably relatively simple to achieve in terms of cognition. So, for instance, if you had ancient humans, pre-humans, living in very complex societies with very complex interactions between them, they probably already had the brains that were capable of understanding language, just because their brains were capable of understanding complex inter-individual interactions. And then it was just a question of having the sort of the acoustics to go along with it. That's sort of like one of the ideas, one of the theories about how language might have evolved.
So the idea here then is, we land on another planet, or we get probes to another planet, or we find something interesting on Enceladus or Titan. things there aren't going to be fundamentally different than what we kind of are already familiar with here on Earth.
Well, I think that there will be obviously a lot that's very fundamentally different, and that arises from the fundamental difference in biochemistry we can expect, fundamental difference in how organisms transmit their heritable information. So we have DNA, we have two parents. There's no reason why there should be two parents, but there are also, it's just a question of identifying which of the characteristics that are contingent, that are dependent on the actual, both on the physical properties of the planet itself, and also on its evolutionary history, the physical history of the planet, which will be subject to all kinds of weird and wonderful coincidences, and which are the things that are really fundamental, which are the ones that just are the product of the laws of evolution, and those we will recognize them instantly.
Really early on in this podcast, I spoke with Natalie Cabral. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's at the SETI Institute. Yeah. And she said flat out, we don't have a working definition of what life is. So when she said that, I thought, well, how the hell do we find it then if we don't know what we're looking for?
Yes. And those are good questions. It is really important to have a definition, because if you are building instruments that are going to look for life, you need to know what to look for. I do think that one point that's worth making is that the kind of things I talk about, the kind of things I write about in my book, are not topics that are generally discussed in astrobiology. Astrobiology usually deals with questions of what is life, how might it evolve, how might it have arisen, what kind of biochemistries, what kind of environments, and so on. And that's because this is a field where we know so little. We have no experimental evidence, and we have very little empirical information. But things are moving fast. We're going to be discovering life on other planets, or at least indications of life on other planets, in the relatively near future. And that means we need to start broadening our perspective. We need to start thinking about ecology. We start thinking about evolution. Both of those things will exist. On any planet where there is life, there will be an ecosystem, there will be interactions between species, and that will drive particular evolutionary processes. And so hopefully this is something that the astrobiological community will start thinking about more.
That was zoologist Dr. Arik Kershenbaum. He's the author of The Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy. You can find him on Twitter at Arik Kershenbaum. That's Arik spelled A-R-I-K. And you can also find us there at Wild Thing Pod. As I mentioned earlier, this is the last episode of Season 2 of Wild Thing, but work on Season 3 is well underway, and you'll be hearing more about it soon. I'll be posting on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and you can also sign up for the mailing list on the website, wildthingpodcast.com. This podcast is a production of Foxtopus Inc. Our executive producer is Scott Carney, editing is by Alicia Lipinski Lincoln, and the score and sound mixing come from Louis Weeks. I'm your host and creator, Laura Krantz.